Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast delving into one issue affecting Israel right now. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan. Will Israel survive until 100? And if so, which Israel will remain? A democratic Jewish state or a Jewish state with a side of democracy? These are questions posed by Professor Eugene Kandel, who served as the head of the National Economic Council and as economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel from 2009 until 2015. Today, he is the founder and chairman of the independent think tank Rise Israel Institute. Rise Israel stands for Resilient, Innovative, Sustainable Economy. In our in-depth discussion, we hear a breakdown of Israel's current societal problems and how they could affect our children. Finally, we hear an out-of-the-box idea to change that divisive trajectory. So this week, we ask Professor Eugene Kandel, what matters now? Eugene, thank you so much for joining me today in the Times of Israel's Jerusalem offices.
Thank you, Amanda, for having me.
I was approached by you to explain something to the greater public. But first of all, can you just describe a little bit about your background and what you've been doing more recently as well?
Well, I was born in Moscow, Soviet Union. When I was 14, my family applied to leave for Israel. We were refused. So we were in this refusnik movement. My father was quite active. In 1977, because of the pressure from Writers Guild in Hollywood, my father is a writer, we were allowed to leave. We came to Israel 4 hours after Anwar Sadat left. So we came to a different country. I studied at Hebrew University. I served in the military as an officer. And then I came to University of Chicago to do my PhD. After that, I was a professor of economics and finance at the University of Rochester Business School. And then 20 years after my first Aliyah, I came back with 3 children to Israel. And since then, until a few months ago, I was a professor of economics and finance at the Hebrew University. Between 2009 and 2015, I served as the head of the National Economic Council and the economic advisor of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. After that, I served as the CEO of Startup Nation Central, which is a nonprofit that was founded by Paul Singer, Terry Cassell, and Dan Senor, and Wendy Singer. And then I left 3 years ago. We started a think tank called Rise Israel, which is Resilient, Innovative, Sustainable Economy. Over the last year, I also serve as the chairman of the board of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, but that position has nothing to do with what I want to talk about today. So it doesn't represent any views of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange or any of its members.
So before we launch into what we came together to discuss, I'd like to also hear your thoughts about the different Israels that you've seen throughout your lifetime. Your first Aliyah was when again?
77.
So describe that Israel in terms of economy and social structure.
This was the middle of what we call the lost decade. Huge part of the economy was government, almost 80%. Huge part of the government was defense. It was over 20% of GDP. So this was a completely different economy. It was a small country, very provincial, very secluded, very scared about its survival. And over time, it evolved into this one of the 15 highest income per capita countries in the world. And I've seen that happen. And it's pretty much a miracle. It had all kinds of things that happened to facilitate that process. But underneath, there are also all kinds of processes that are coming to threaten the continuation of that process. And that's what I wanted to talk about.
Okay, but before we launch into that, just one more word on what you found when you came back to Israel in your second Aliyah.
It was a completely different country. I was away for 12 years. I kept close contact. My family lives here, my wife's family, so we were coming all the time. But there was a change after 85. We left in 85. That was right in the middle of the dramatic change of the Israeli economy opening up, becoming a market economy, that whole socialist past of the Israeli economy was starting to crumble, and right on time, because otherwise we would be very, very lagging very much behind. And so it was very exciting to see these things. And I came to the government in 2009 in the middle of the global financial crisis. And the stuff that we did in 6 years, spent 6 years there over 3 governments, it was amazing to see the evolution of this high-tech economy and the admiration of the world towards Israel because of that.
So it sounds like we're at a high point, and from our previous conversation off mic, it sounds to me that you're very concerned that things are taking a downturn. So you've laid out 4 different areas of concern, essentially. So let's start with what you're seeing in terms of the collapse of social structure.
Let me start. We tend to look in the rear view mirror when we think about the country. We never do that when we drive. And, it's not a good idea to look in the rear view mirror when you drive forward at high speed. And that's what we're trying to do. Israel, more than any other country in the world, is subject to shocks, all kinds of very, very dramatic shocks, just like everybody else. Economic shocks, technological shocks, geopolitical shocks, all of them, we're subject to them. But we're also subject to shocks that no other country is subject to, which is a number of very determined enemies who want to destroy us, as well as growing public opinion that Israel is not a legitimate country to exist at all. So no other country in the world has this problem. And in order to withstand all these shocks and be strong and prosperous, we have to be very, very resilient. In order to be resilient, you need 4 things. 1, you need a very cohesive society. You need a very competitive economy. You need a very competent government. And all 3 of those allow you to have a very strong security system that can deter, that can detect, and then can decisively determine the outcome of any military conflict if need be. So if we're asking ourselves, rather than looking in the rearview mirror, looking forward, in all 4 counts, we're having trouble. We do not have a cohesive society, and then going forward, we're going to have less and less cohesive society for a very simple reason, that Israeli society is split into 3 completely different visions based on irreconcilable values. There's one part of the population wants Jewish democratic country, where Jewish means you define how you want to be Jewish, and democratic means that elections, of course, but also limits on the government power, due process, etc., separation of powers. This is one part of the population. That part was the vast majority, but it's been shrinking in percentage terms. There is a second large part of the population, which legitimately, in democracy, we cannot say that some views or some visions or some values are not legitimate. Thinks that Israel should be Jewish democratic when both terms have to be interpreted very narrowly. So Jewish, there's one way to be Jewish, and democratic means whoever won the elections, he's the king. On top of that, that group feels that if Torah law conflicts with the state law, you either have to change the state law or you just have to ignore it. So it's not something that I tell about them. It's something that they say about themselves. And the third group says, look, we don't really understand what this whole Jewish thing about. We want the country of all citizens, and this is about half of the Arab society. And there is some people on the very, very far left in the Jewish society. So you have these 3 groups that cannot accept the other values. I mean, literally cannot accept. So this is not about that let us all make some concessions and we'll all be fine. No, if I make my concessions, that means that I'm giving up my values. And you are imposing your values on me. Because the values are incompatible, that means that when we fight to defend our values, and every group in Israel feels that foreign values are imposed on it, and they fight to defend their values. What they don't feel is that they're attacking anybody. But in fact, when you defend the values that are incompatible with other values, you in fact attacking other values. And so the end result is that we all live in fear of each other, and we're fighting to not let the other side to impose its value. So the one side fights to maintain the Supreme Court as a protector of its values. The other side fights to reduce the power of Supreme Court as imposer of foreign values on them. So there is no way for us to agree about the values.
In your model, the third section seems almost, I don't mean to disregard them, but almost negligible in terms of
At this stage they are, because they don't have a real political power. But they are there, and if you were asking questions about what are the three visions, these are not the four tribes that President Rivlin talked about. These are three incompatible visions. And the people would be allocated, if you ask them what kind of vision you can live with or under, and what kind of vision you cannot live, people will split along the four tribes. There is correlation, of course, but there will be no perfect match. The second problem is competitive economy. If we take the groups of people, large groups of people in the Israeli society that basically say, we're going to determine how we're going to live, how we're going to behave, and the cost of those decisions will be borne by somebody else, because we cannot and do not want to bear the cost, because these decisions are unsustainable economically. Now, when you do that, it's not just Haredi, but Haredi represent the biggest problem because they grow so fast. But there is also other groups that do the same. If you take Bedouins, there are other groups that do that when they impose their costs associated with their values and their way of life on others. When they say, well, the state should support us. The state is not nameless people. These are taxpayers from other groups. So if you do fast forward, between 25 and 35 years from now, this process becomes unsustainable. You cannot sustain the economy like that. When huge growing population basically says, you're going to support your family, but you're also going to support my family, or maybe two of my family. That cannot work. No, it's not. You don't need to have a PhD in economics to understand that. The third problem...
Before you skip forward, when we were speaking last week, you mentioned something that I found just really fascinating and slightly chilling, is that the war is actually changing the outlook, whereas it was, as you said, 20 to 30 years. Now with the war, I believe you said to me, it's shrinking that outlook, and it could be something like 10 to 15 years. Is that correct?
It is correct, because what the war has done is actually four things. The war gave us false hope that we're now united and we are one. It took about 2-3 months to recognize that our old differences manifest themselves very, very harshly. And we now even more at odds than we were before. 2, the rising anti-Semitism reduced the probability of people leaving the country to escape all this fighting. But that's only on the surface, because it depends how bad it will be here for people to leave. Third is that people lost faith in the ability of the state to protect them, which was there. The people didn't have much trust in the state, but one thing they were sure, that when push comes to shove, Tzal, IDF will be there. It wasn't there on October 7th. So that is a huge shock. And the last thing is that those 250, 300 billion shekels that we will have to spend right now and then increase in the defense budget will have to be borne by a very small percentage of the population, which already has to bear the cost of other groups making this decision. And the other groups, as we saw, are not saying, well, you know what, we're going to reduce our demands, so we all will participate. No, they say, no, you give us what we demand, and you guys figure it out how you do. So the unsustainability of all this is just being hastened because we now have to come up with another 300 billion shekels, which is equivalent to about 6 years of subsidy.
it's good that you mentioned the word subsidy, because we're seeing in the news that already efforts are being made to reduce the education budget, to reduce the revecha, the social welfare budget. And, one would think, the rich will pay more taxes. They're already rich. Who cares? Whatever. But no, it seems like again and again, it's the poor who are going to actually suffer even more than they are today.
No, it's both, because 90% of all these subsidies and 70% of all taxes are paid by the first decile of income earners. Okay? So these people are now asked to participate in paying for another 300 billion shekels over the next few years. Now, in addition, of course, you have to reduce other budgets because you don't want to reduce the transfers, because this subsidy is ingrained in people. This is like entitlement. They feel that they're entitled for that, and they're entitled for more. Again, I'm completely in favor of having anybody having their own ways of lives. What I'm not in favor of, and it cannot be sustainable, is to saying, I'm going to decide how I live, and you're going to pay for it, which is one of the senior ministers in this government said that in numerous interviews in the beginning of this government. He said, we're going to decide how we live, and you're going to pay for it. That's not going to work. So the third part is the competent government. I mean, I don't even have to go into this, but I would ask your listeners to just trust me as somebody who spent 6 years within the government in senior position and the next 9 years advising the government from outside. Israeli government is structurally organized in one of the worst possible ways to be effective and efficient. One of the worst possible cases. I can talk about it for 2 hours. I don't want to.
Just one question on it. You're talking about the Israeli government always, or this particular government?
No. It's a structure. That's why I'm saying it doesn't matter which government. Of course, if you put completely incompetent people in key positions, that worsens it. But what I'm claiming is that the structure of the government, of how it's structured, is attracting incompetence in many cases, and more so. In the past, when the government people were competent and high caliber, they would cover for something, but still the government was much less effective and much less efficient than they could have been. But when you add in incompetent people, that just manifests itself, as we saw after October 7th. The government didn't function for a while. It was the people that rose and volunteered and saved the day. It was amazing to see, and Israelis are amazing that way, how they rise. And I've seen it from Lebanon war, first Lebanon war, when I was in the military. It was amazing to see even then. But the government is dysfunctional. So that is the third part, which is very difficult. And those three, since they're looking forward, very, very weak, how can we have a strong defensive capabilities? So the bottom line is that we are afraid. It's my partner, Ron Zur, who was also in senior government positions for a long time. We are worried that at some point, a group of people, sufficiently large group of people, will lose confidence that their children will have a future here, and they will leave. And then what we call a run on the country may happen, because run on the country is just like run on the bank. If you decided to leave, you want to be the first. And why do you want to be the first? Because your real estate is still expensive. You can sell it. There's no constraints on taking money out. And when you go into Holland or Singapore or Australia or United States, there are no 200,000 other Israelis knocking on their doors. Now, the problem of run on the bank or run on the country is that it's unpredictable when it happens, because it's about expectations. And when it happens, it's very fast and it's very violent, because it starts a spiral that you cannot stop.
Have you seen this happen elsewhere?
Oh, of course. We've seen this many times. Well, not many times, because usually governments realize that might happen and do so. You've seen that in the United States in cities. that basically started certain policies in the 60s and the 70s, basically bankrupted cities, and all the people who were most productive left the cities, and cities collapsed. You saw that in Venezuela. Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world in 1980. Today, they have no food. You've seen that in Lebanon, which was the star of the Middle East. It was Switzerland of the Middle East. It was completely, for different reasons, but completely decimated. Today, it's a bankrupt country because all of its elites, all of its productive people left. You see Russia the same way. You can see many countries that suffer because they put ideology, wrong ideology, first, and they didn't think about the consequences of that.
You began the discussion talking about the external pressures versus the internal pressures. We've delved mostly into the internal pressures, but the external pressures are real. Anti-Semitism is real. Anti-Israelism is a real thing. So do you think that this would tamp down the run on the country, that it would make it less likely?
Well, that's on one side. On the other side, even our friendly countries are seeing that Israelis are, not clear for them whether they see the future. They poach them. We just saw 18 senior medical professionals were poached by one country, which waived their licensing, and they are leaving as a group. We have a huge shortage of this profession, especially after October 7th, and yet they're leaving because they don't see the future here for their children. And that country actually initiated that because they see there are many countries that would love to have the most productive Israelis in their midst. You have a big Israeli community over the last year in Cyprus. You have a community in Greece, in Portugal, in the United States. You see this, we have to stop that. We have to not stop people from leaving. We have to stop the reason. We have to give people a future, a hope for the future, and we have to do it right now. So any solution that anybody proposes has to be fast and has to have 4 conditions. One, we have to stop the war of values. The only way to stop the war of values is not to win. It's an unwinnable war. Not to compromise. You cannot compromise. It's to protect everybody's values. So there is no reason to fight about them. The second thing we have...
Before you move on from that, say your value is to learn Torah and not work and not support your family. So how can you protect that?
Well, that's the second part. The second part is every community, every large group that has specific values that it has to protect, has to be willing and able to pay for those values. You cannot have your values and ask somebody else to pay for them. That is illegitimate. Values legitimate, you sticking to these values, but you paying for these values. So the second part is that every large group has to pay for its own way of life. The third thing, we have to drastically modify the structure of Israeli government to make it effective and professional, dedicated to public service, rather than dedicated to openly giving benefits to its base. That's not going to help. That may happen on the margins of pork barrels, etc., in the U.S. But the mainstream is still thinking about the country. We cannot afford this at all. And the last thing, that all of that needs to be done in such a way that it's irreversible. Because if the demography can change it in 10, 15 years, then we're done. Because it's just postponing the end. So these 4 conditions, values, economy, competent government, and irreversibility, will ensure that Israel can start moving to becoming one of the most admired, productive, rich, and safe countries in the world.
Okay, at the beginning, we talked about the 3 different groups and their irreconcilable differences. But we also discussed how they are like an accordion. They can enlarge and contract. And so right now, of course, we said that there's one group that's almost not worth counting the numbers in terms of percentage, but the other 2 groups have shifted over time. And so how can you say that what this fourth position needs to be irrevocable because the values could shift for the population.
Well, I'm not saying that the values should be irrevocable. I'm saying that we have to solve these problems in such a way that the solution works for everybody forever. We have to build a structure, a platform. And on that we can agree. We cannot agree on values, but we can agree on two things. One is all of us want to see this country celebrate its 100th birthday. Two, that we have to agree on a structure that would allow us not to fight, not to fear each other, instead collaborate. Okay, that is something that we can agree upon. And this is exactly the structure. And that structure is supposed to solve all these four problems. Okay, so the structure is irreversible. The values, people can change values, move, etc. Of course, this is democracy. But the structure that forces the how people interact without fear and with collaboration has to stay immovable unless a huge majority wants to move it, wants to change. So that is what we propose. We propose basically creating, today in Israel, we have two centers of power. We have a central government. It's a unitary system, central government that is elected through Knesset, and a local government. Israel is the most centralized country in the OECD, by far. So the central government holds all the power, most of the power, and the most, I mean, over 90%, and even sees the local government as its long arm for executing its policy. So it doesn't even see the local government. For example, the Minister of Internal Affairs can replace the mayor with signing a letter. Okay, of course, he needs some reason, but that's as simple as that. The elections happen on both levels, and the fight for values, for defense of values, happens on both levels. We are saying, let us remove the fight. How do you remove the fight? You introduce another layer of government. You basically create something similar to United States, to Switzerland, to Belgium. You create a layer that is called, we call it aluma. Aluma is a ray of light in Hebrew, because we want to create three different groups with different sets of values enshrined in something like constitution of that group, that these values are very hard to change. And every Israeli citizen has to choose one. So think about you being a citizen of Israel, but your ID card belongs to one of these three groups. So you say, I want to be in Jewish democratic, widely liberal democracy. Another neighbor says, I want to be in the country of all citizens. And the third one says, I want to be in Torah nationalistic group. Absolutely fine. It doesn't require you to move. It's not a geographical separation. It's a value separation. And once you've done that, you basically now with the group of people that share your values. Now we have to protect them. How do we protect them? We take the voting from the central government. There are no longer elections to the Knesset. The elections are to representative bodies within each of these autonomies or alumot. Okay, so we no longer fight in our elections over whose values will win, and winner take all will impose them on others. We are voting within values. So we're voting on economy, we're voting on welfare system, on healthcare, on education, within our systems of values. So within each of these entities, there is much more homogeneity. So there's much less reason to fight. Across them, there's no fighting because the federal constitution does not allow one autonomy to influence the value of other autonomy. And politically, they cannot, you do not elect my representatives and I don't elect yours. And so you literally cannot affect my values. So once we've done that, we then nominate all these three groups, nominate their representatives into Knesset. So it's still a democracy, but like in the US, you nominate your senator from state of Kentucky and state of Massachusetts, state of California, you nominate the senators, and you nominate in a particular election process. It could be different process. And then they govern the union.
How do you see party politics in this? Is it basically negating party politics?
No, there will be different party politics will no longer fight over saying that your values are wrong and my values are right. You are the traitor and I'm the true patriot in both directions. No, you cannot affect my values. So sending people to Knesset whose only skill is to get reelected and to be divisive and yelling at each other and offending each other is not going to be a reasonable strategy, no matter which party you are. First of all, the parties will now be within these autonomies or alumot, rather than across. Because it doesn't make sense for you. There could be unions of different parties in terms of a collaboration of different parties, and they would want to promote similar policies on the federal level. But it's separate. That's completely legitimate. But the parties will not arise, and the people will not rise to the top based only on the skill, how well they can divide and conquer, because there will be nothing to divide.
This sounds extremely utopian and very radical. And
it's not utopian at all, because that's how Switzerland is run. That's how United States in much of the ways run. Belgium, by the way, was a Unitarian country until 1970, and they were about to split because there was a change in the relative powers of people from Flanders versus Vallones. And they said, okay, we don't want to split. We want to stay one country. Let's change the constitution to give space to each other to express our own values and culture, etc. They've done that. They didn't do it quick enough and deep enough. So they had to do it 3 or 4 times over the next 30 or 40 years. But the fact that it's possible to do, and it unifies the country. Sometimes you see people on both sides using anashim achim anachnu, which means that we are brothers. Okay, and it's from Tanakh. When Abraham says this to Lot, they actually say, anashim achim anachnu, we're brothers, therefore you go left and then I go right, so our people will not fight over the pastures. Or you go left and then I'll go right. Okay? So let's give ourselves a little bit space so we can do what we want to do on our own without fighting. And then we'll stay brothers and collaborate on other things. That's what is offered. There is another thing that I need to stress is that in order to introduce, that's not enough to protect the values. You also have to reduce the ability of one side to coerce the other side economically. And so these structures, these autonomies, need to have all the taxation capabilities. So the federal government is appointed and not elected, and the federal budget is built from contribution from these 3 economies. So you immediately given the responsibility for your economic well-being and the ability to develop an incentive to develop your own economy. Today, the Haredi society, Haredi leadership is not thinking about developing Haredi, maximizing the potential of Haredi society to create economic value. The main goal of the representatives of Haredi society in the Knesset is to take as much as possible resource, as much as possible from the others. That's dividing the cake. It's not increasing the cake. The system that we propose is introducing incentives to increase each one's cake. Now, of course, we have to be mindful to the fact that if you move to this system immediately and you don't make any adjustments, some communities will collapse. So what we propose is to maintain the same degree of cross-subsidization as we have now, let's say a year ago, going forward 20 or maybe even 30 years, but as a fixed amount. So which means that all the decisions that you, the community, made in the past, we're going to continue support you. So moving from today to tomorrow, your standard of living doesn't decline. But all your decisions going forward, when you decide on your way of life, it's up to you to pay for it. So you have to, if you want certain way of life, you have to develop your economy to pay for it. Because we are giving you a fixed amount, and so if that amount is fixed, that means that if you want to increase your population, for example, and not to work, the amount per capita shrinks very rapidly. I mean, if you want that, that is your decision, fine. I'm not saying to you, I'm not paternalistic in saying to you that you have to do something. You do not have to study, you do not have to work, but then you will have to pay for it by drastically reducing your standard of living, your quality of your education, quality of your welfare, quality of your health system. You just cannot afford all the things that you could afford until today because it is just not sustainable. The country will collapse if we continue like that.
We began our discussion talking about the different Israels that you've seen in your lifetime. And when you came here in 77, you saw a more collective Israel. And it sounds in a way that you're somewhat trying to shift back, at least to that mentality. But the Israelis themselves have changed a lot over the several decades. And even the kibbutzim are mostly privatized and everyone for himself. So do you see that the society is capable of making this very drastic shift?
I think not only, first of all, I'm not sure. I would push back on the fact that Israelis are less collective, because what 7th of October showed, where thousands of people flew back from all over the world to fight, and thousands of people, the draft to the reserves was 120%. Okay, of those who were 20% additional people were not called came. And what's even more important, people were driving into terrorist-infested area and taking families out to rescue them without any weapons. It was just amazing, and the degree of volunteering that we saw and degree of organization. The speed with which the communities organized and created huge rescue efforts and support efforts was amazing. And it was all because we're Israelis and we care about each other.
But it was also, just to push back, it was also very much emergency in the moment. And Israelis are great at finding ways out of problems that are happening right now, but not so good at problems that are happening in 30 years.
Absolutely. That is why we think there should be a very strong and focused effort on educating Israelis how to think about a bit further than today and tomorrow, because our political system definitely doesn't encourage that. On all sides, by the way, there's no strategic thinking. There is no risk management. We have to have, and that brings me to my last point, is that it is our strong belief that we have to have a formal voice for the world Jewry in the Israeli discourse. We have to bring this voice. It could not be a legislative voice, not now. But as October 7th showed, that when what happens here happens to the Jewish communities. What happens here, Jewish communities help us to take care of what happens here. And what's the most important, Jewish communities are not involved in this bitter values fight. They can be a bit of a independent arbitration, or at least some kind of sanity looking. And the last point is just to what you just said, is that Jewish communities around the world are much more forward-looking than Israelis. I don't know why is that, but that's just the nature of Jewish communities. I was just talking to the French community, and they think they have long history of thinking in terms of coming together and solving problems. We have a problem. We have actually two big problems that may break us down, and in our world, internal problems and external problems are not detached. Our internal problems will facilitate the external problems, and our enemies know that. Nasrallah, many years ago, gave this spiderweb speech in which he said, with all their tanks and the aircraft and all their technology, their society is crumbling, and we're just going to pick them up with our bare hands. And that is the danger that we have to stop. It has to be our primary concern, no matter what degree of religiosity we have, what party we vote for, what vision we have. We have to have one priority, and that priority is to make Israel sustainable and resilient. And we must have a structure that will allow us to stop fighting and be united, not in our values, not in our visions, not in how we want to live day-to-day life, but in our joint desire and aim to maintain Israel as a strong home for the Jewish people for many, many, many centuries, and not just for the next 10 years.
Eugene, this has been really eye-opening and fascinating, and I look forward to hearing more about this Alumot project. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Amanda. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.